All right. Hey, everyone. So this is going to be the lecture on chapter 13, which is going to be talking about sexual violence. Again, a reminder that this lecture is going to be one that you are going to want to skip if your personal history ties into sexual violence or physical violence or domestic violence in any way. If you need resources, there are resources linked on the slides at the end of both PowerPoints on chapter 12 and chapter 13. Again, this material is heavy. Take care of yourself as you are working through it, as it is not an easy task. If you need extensions for whatever the reason through spring break to work through this, please don't hesitate to ask, as I want to make sure that you have the ability to work through this at a pace that is reasonable to you. All right, so here we are. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen. Again, here's your content notes for everything that we're going to talk about within this section. Okay, so we're going to get into some terms. Rape is considered the penetration, no matter how slight, the vagina or anus with any part of the body or object or oral penetration by a sex organ of another person without the consent of the victim. Again, consent here is going to be a big part of the conversation that we have. Statutory rape is considered a sex crime in which sexual relations take place between an adult and a young person below the age of consent. Again, note that the age of consent is differing depending on the state that you are in. Also, the age range that can be there between the young person and the adult also varies depending on the state you are in. Date rape and acquaintance rape are rape that happens between two people who know each other and are willing to spend time together. Again, these things happen far more common than stranger rape, and that is something that we'll get into as we move forward. Sometimes it occurs after one party has been given actually a chemical substance to intoxicate or incapacitate the other party. So sexual assault is essentially includes any violence that is done to a person based on any kind of sexual contact and or any kind of sexual innuendos or what have you. Sexual violence is a broad term to describe any sexual act committed against someone without that person's freely given consent. Intimate partner violence is the violence that is done within any kind of relationship. So this does not necessarily just mean, when we talk about domestic violence, generally you're talking about married people, but because we have a much more wide variety of relationship statuses, the intimate partner violence term really covers dating. It covers if you're engaged, it covers a wide variety of terms for those who are in partnerships that maybe aren't inherently sexual. It also includes most of your date and acquaintance rape and things of that nature. And again, all of these definitions are going to legally vary depending on your state, your location, your country, all of those things. So just a reminder that April is Sexual Assault Month and October is Domestic Violence Month. Again, this is why I'm wearing the teal and the purple for the remainder of this lecture. Again, April is also National Child Abuse Month, Prevention Month. So April is a very important month. It's also generally when you have your Take Back the Nights and when you have your green dot speeches and when you have the things like your vagina monologues, any kind of things of that nature. You're going to see a lot of sexual assault prevention stuff, even on your campus. So rape culture is a culture in which rape is so widespread that it is normalized. So it does not mean that this is something that people are going to outright say, hey, I would do this because it's okay. It's going to be things that are more that encourage male aggression, violence against women, or make it seem very natural or inevitable. So because sexual violence happens at such a huge rate within our culture, we create these ideologies that this is something that just happens. It's just part of being in a specific arena, maybe say being in a campus life, being in sorority life, being at parties, what have you, when that is not the case. Rape culture includes these ideas or these rape myths that are attitudes and inaccurate beliefs about rape that are served to deny, justify, or perpetuate men's sexual aggression against women, and or any kind of sexual aggression towards another person. So these are things like she's asking for it because she's wearing a low-cut skirt, or she flirted with me, so it was consensual, or just because she had had a few things to drink doesn't means that she has the ability to consent. If she's unconscious and she consented before she was unconscious, it's still consent. That if a woman is being raped, they will not, it physically won't work. There won't be any kind of arousal. There won't be any kind of bodily function that happens, and or that physically somehow their body is going to shut down. All of these things are myths. These are not accurate statements. Again, that husbands cannot rape their wives. All of these things are surrounded by these myths and these things that are inaccurate depictions of how rape actually works. Again, we're also going to talk about victimization and the fact that usually when individuals do report any kind of rape or sexual violence, predominantly they experience some kind of double victimization through any kind of institution that they are getting resources from, and or through the legal process. It is not a fun time to have to relive and reaccount possibly the most traumatic thing that has ever happened to someone. And so really having that conversation, or really having an understanding of this, leads people to not report very often. And so that is how we have these really, really, really troubling statistics about reporting and also the frequency at which these things happen. And we're going to get into it right now. There's multitudes of reasons why survivors don't report, including some of these myths. Hey, I was underage, I was drinking because I was doing these things, I was asking for it. Or, hey, I was flirting with him before the night, so I guess that was me consenting. That's not the case. They fear not being believed or not having access to the right people to report to. Remember that if you report any kind of incident like this on a college campus, it creates a college, usually a Title IX investigation, which has college implications for that individual, but does not create a legal process. And so you would have to file charges with not only a police, but also go through the Title IX office to do something academically with this person, like say, get them not in the same classes or you, or what have you. So having to go through multiple measures can, and not always knowing that there are multiple measures, can create barriers to reporting. Not feeling safe in reporting, and or having somebody feel like they have threatened you to keep something like this quiet. Worried about that double victimization. Again, that's a big one, because that is something that is consistently been shown. They were engaging again in illegal acts, possibly with sex work, possibly with drinking underage, possibly with being somewhere they weren't supposed to, or what have you. They don't want to be scrutinized or be put under a microscope for any of their choices or any of the things that they did prior to this encounter. There's possibility that the offender has some kind of social power, control, or networking that creates obstacles to a person reporting. So a perfect example of this is, say there is someone, a very prominent sports figure or political figure, who ends up sexually assaulting someone. Is someone more likely to believe that person who has that social network, that social clout, or are they more likely to believe the person that is talking? So there are gendered, racial, and otherwise hierarchies increase this dynamic of not wanting to report, including the dynamics that happen within law enforcement. If there's a long history of law enforcement not being kind to the kinds of identities that you have or you carry, there is a much less likelihood that you're going to want to go towards that arena to have these conversations. Again, PTSD and other traumas are high probabilities for these individuals, and so these things can create barriers or lack of desire to want to do these things. Again, people don't want to relive it. They have seen what happens to other people. That can happen. They've been threatened or otherwise coerced into silence. They fear social or physical retaliation. Again, that he said, she said battle can get really ugly when the social networks are concerned. They believe the rape myths themselves. They buy into some of those rape myths or that rape culture. They just want to move on. They are already a member of a vulnerable population. So there are several, there's a very high statistical probability that if you are a trans woman, especially a trans woman of color, that sexual violence will happen to you. But because you hold a status that makes you part of a vulnerable population, your ability to report is significantly decreased. You could also have language barriers or immigration status barriers that keep you from reporting, or simply they don't want to. That is also a valid reason for not reporting. And so there's a lot of barriers and a lot of reasons for not wanting to report, and all of them are valid. Consequences of sexual violence. So real quick, we're going to talk about the difference between the language used about that person. Unless someone specifically wants to be referred to as a victim, that's usually a term that reminds someone of the lack of control and power that they had in a situation. But the term survivor is a more uplifting. It channels a very different emotional response. It channels a very different linguistic connotation. And so typically that is the term that is utilized. On the flip side of that, you're going to see that even the term survivor can be something that is harsh to someone who has experienced any kind of violence. And so their story is theirs. If they honor you in telling you that story, make sure that you understand that it is theirs and not yours to tell, display, or do anything about, if that makes sense. Safety, increased feelings of being unsafe or isolation are things that can happen to survivors post any kind of trauma. And this is not just sexual violence. This can happen in a number of cases. PTSD, and it can be long or short term. You can also have complex PTSD, which is when you start ranging into that more long-term situational PTSD. There is physical injury that can happen when the course of sexual violence that needs to be addressed and can leave lingering scars, both physically and within ability status. So those are also things that need to be part of the conversation. Mental health survivors have increased suicidal tendencies, eating disorders, sleep disorders, and depression, along with other things. And educational outcomes, they have higher dropout rates, lower grades, decreased memory function, and a much more likelihood of dropping classes or dropping out altogether. So feminism and the violence against women prevention. So feminism has been a big part of violence prevention in this country, and the tracking some of the big wins that violence prevention has had. And their ideas on violence against women is that rape is a gendered hate crime, considering that overwhelmingly this happens from with men as offenders and women as the subjects of the violence. That intersectionality plays a part in your increased risk of having this happen, having these kinds of violences happen to you. It also is understood as a personal and psychological issue, not just a physical or sexual thing that happens to you. And that there's issues in messaging geared towards women protecting themselves as opposed to men not perpetrating these kinds of violence acts. And so calling attention to the fact that that dynamic is toxic in and of itself. That there are cultural and societal discussions of consent, busting rape myths, that rape, more conversations of rape culture broadly, victim blaming, naming the problems, and connecting to gender roles and other systems of oppression. So really talking about this in a wide range. Feminism has been doing this for a very, very long time. They create consent trainings. Not all consent trainings are created by feminist facilities, but most of the first ones came out of feminist movements. Violence Against Women Act is directly correlated to feminist movements asking for these things. Green Dot, your Title IX came out of a feminist movement, really talking about control. You have Take Back the Nights that came out of feminist actions, and a result, again, talking about these as a result of hierarchy and gender inequality more broadly. And so we can't really talk about these hierarchies and these inequalities without talking about the violence that comes out of them. And so really having some of these big, huge conversation is part of what feminism was about, or consistently is about. Talking about campus rates, there's high rates of victimization on campuses. Again, I'll graphic for you down here in the bottom. And we're probably closer to 30% of college women, and that 15% of college men is going to be dramatically different depending on the other varying population statuses that that person might have. There's significantly low reporting rates, and LGBTQ plus persons face an increased risk of sexual violence on campus as well as anywhere else. Stalking and harassments have high rates on campus, and college Title IX claims have procedural changes and are not legal proceedings. So some of those procedural changes that happened during the Trump administration was this acceptance of and creation of a space where there is cross-examination from the offender to the victim as part of the process, that created a dynamic that was incredibly damaging to reporting statistics and also to the process as a whole. The survivor is not the one under investigation and should not ever be the one under investigation. This should be about the claims that have happened to those persons. Higher risks include drinking and substance use. Dorms and sororities tend to have more sexual violence that happens within those places, and that generally is due to this kind of frat culture being consistently sexist and consistently including violence against women. That does not mean that if you are in a fraternity, you fall under that category. It means that fraternity culture cultivates rape culture in a very specific way. So before we get into this, and we got into this a little bit in chapter 12, I'm going to go ahead and stop for this lecture, and we'll get back to it in just a bit. Again, take care of yourselves, as none of these conversations are easy, and it's topics that can hit home for a large percentage of the population.